What you're going to see are the designs and pictures and stories that music inspired in the minds and imaginations of a group of artists. In other words, these are not going to be the interpretations of trained musicians, which I think is all to the good. Now, there are three kinds of music on this Fantasia program. First, there's the kind that tells a definite story. Then there's the kind that, while it has no specific plot, does paint a series of more or less definite pictures. Then there's the third kind, music that exists simply for its own sake. Now, the number that opens our Fantasia program, a toccata and fugue, is music of this third kind, what we call absolute music. Even the title has no meaning beyond a description of the form of the music.
So as part of our listening assignment, I pulled out Fantasia and Fantasia 2000 to just listen to the first movement of Beethoven's symphony with another concept of art, the art that the artist drew. The clip was from Fantasia, but Beethoven's Fifth is in Fantasia 2000, and that idea of absolute music really just kind of struck a chord with what we are discussing, and the idea of the musical museum and how these works have been framed for a musical museum and set there, and how they define absolute music as music that just stands for itself. And they, from the back to Beethoven, about music who not need words still needs, or in the program still needs words to describe the program. And how in that Fantasia introduction that telling a story or having a definite set of pictures separates that music from what would be absolute music, such as the toccata and fugue or Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and how that is really correlates with these ideas of having a musical museum or having a classical canon. As far as the educational perspectives, having Hoffman, whose day job was being completely unrelated from the arts, but in the evening being a musician and a writer and a music appreciator. And I believe that those of us who are studying and learning about Kodály could tell you that he was a man who dreamed of people having these average day jobs, but could still love, appreciate, read, understand, comprehend all these magical things that happen within a symphony or in a concert or in a concerto or in an opera and all these other different things. And how quality music for Kodály doesn't just exist at the Beethoven level, but quality music exists at the child level. And that these folk music and things that we collect, things that are gems and treasures that kids love and enjoy and can participate with, still are these quality music. And if we were framing them as we do frame them and put them in our collections and analyze them and keep them and store them and use them, we are creating our own musical museum, but it's simpler pieces than Beethoven's Fifth. But Beethoven's Fifth, in its own right, listening to the whole piece, that's the first time I've listened to the second, third movements for a while, just in its own right, really is just listening to it really is just simple. Yes, there's theoretical complexities and tonal harmonies and form and everything else in it, but in and of itself, it's just simplistically beautiful outside of all the theory. But as a musician, I can appreciate that theory. And as a teacher and an educator, the idea of hearing, that just being a listener versus listening, is a huge thing I try to push for my children and for my kids. And the idea from Dr. Pippin that these works weren't just standing the test of time, but they have had continual engagement, with some exceptions, continual engagement of certain works, such as Shakespeare in literature, or Beethoven with his symphonies, or even fragments of Beethoven through the time, is really interesting. And continuing this idea of how Hoffman received and wrote about Beethoven as a listener and as a music appreciator and a musician, and all these things all kind of wrapped up together, really got me thinking not only about Kodály, but since the time that I spent this last year with Little Kids Rock, and one of the founders was an ESL teacher, and so takes this huge perspective of music as a second language and keeping that composition engagement even at the simplest level, that students who just walk in and can play three chords on the guitar and that's all they've got, they can be brilliant composers. I mean, listen to what we think of as brilliant classics in the pop and rock world and how very little structure there actually is to those. There's an artistic simplicity and beauty that we take um, through our aesthetic fulfillment as our arbiter of quality. But we take these things and apply them, and even though it's aesthetically fulfilling, even if it doesn't have a lot of structure or a lot of theory within it, it's still something that can be absolutely beautiful. And teaching our students that it doesn't take a lot to write something that is aesthetically pleasing. That if they are putting into the work what if they're putting themselves into the work, which is scary, but if they're putting themselves into their work, that is something that can truly be of value, and encouraging that as an educator at every level, elementary through high school. Another thing that really stuck out to me from the discussion was that the performer should disappear from the work. When we go to the symphony, for instance, we go to the Colorado Symphony, we're not listening to the Colorado Symphony musicians. We might listen to a virtuoso play a concerto, but when we listen to the symphony, we're listening to Beethoven, or we're listening to Schubert, or we're listening to Brahms. And I went to the symphony and I listened to Beethoven. It's interesting how that idea of the performer disappearing from the work even works into our vocabulary, or listening to these recordings. We say, well, I listened to Beethoven, or I haven't listened to Beethoven in a while. Well, we're not truly listening to the man, we're listening to his work. We're being performed by other musicians and led by other conductors, and that idea of the performer disappearing has really just influenced how we even speak as musicians. And so that was another thing that they really popped up from this work. But I'm really looking forward to continuing to delve into these ideas of how we perceive composition as educators within the world of our classical canon and musical museum.